But yeah, look, now Hannah Hopewell is mostly based in Wellington. She travels all around. She's a very fluid thinker and mover, and trained in urban design, as I understand. Has just completed a PhD and is a really inspiring thinker. That I'll let her introduce herself perhaps, but you call yourself a transdisciplinary researcher, and you're teaching currently in the school that I'm in the landscape section of Victoria University Te Herenga, Waka. Over to you, Hannah.
Kia ora. Just let me make sure I've got some volume here. The rain has started coming down and it's a little noisy, so excuse me if I'm shouting. I've got to hear myself over the rain. Kia ora tātou everyone. This is really terrific to be here. Thank you so much, Sophie, for organising this, and I want to affirm what Becky said at the outset, that yes, you're a connector, and appreciate that. Thank you. And yeah, I've got questions too that are bubbling up, but it does feel right to bring them at the end. I feel there's a really nice follow-on from my talk following Fiona, as there's some significant overlaps, I think, to some of our thinking. So what I'm going to present is rather hastily put together, and so I'll say it's some things I've been thinking about, more collections of observation and speculation that on the one hand emerge from the spatiality of the COVID situation, and on the other observations around a perspectival shift impacting or potentially impacting governmentality, rationality and forms of regulations that are enacted and understood. So I kind of want to call this perspectival shift under the rubric of general ecology. So it's the ecologization, of our ways of being, and that it foremost presents a techno-ecological condition. So these thoughts, they coalesce around both the very possibilities and the political imperatives of what commoning is, or commons and commoning is, and as a spatial concern. So I'm going to suggest here that commoning itself is obviously spatial, and it's also plays a significant part in our collective imaginative faculties as it transits how we re-world, or how we imagine the world beyond the anthropological paradigm. So in that sense, what I'm talking at is really, really broad scale and paradigm shift, I guess, to use the terminology, and that it actually completely comes down to the ground, our situated being, as to what we might mean by community. So I'm suggesting a kind of a radical reorientation to what means when we use the word community. So I'm a landscape architect. I have practiced landscape architecture, also urban design, but I like to call myself a transdisciplinary researcher because I undertake practice in an expanded field. I'm not very good with boundaries in that regard, and I'm interested in ideas that break down the boundaries between what we might think of as dualisms like theory and practice. My PhD is in spatial design. It was a creative practice PhD, and I took up a kind of form of performative thinking practice regards to waterfronts and lake capitalism. So historically, pandemics have forced us to, or humans, to break with the past and to imagine worlds anew. I was reading in the Financial Times a few months ago, Aaron Harty-Roy's comments that this particular pandemic is no different. And I particularly like that she kind of composed it as like a portal or a gateway between one world and the next. So it feels in this uncertain time, and sorry if I'm mixing up my tenses, it's like past, present, lockdown's kind of in the past for us in New Zealand, who knows, it might come back. But I'm just going to mix those tenses up at the moment, so forgive me for that. But this current time is without a doubt uncertain. And it seems to me there is this imagine to re-world, or to participate in the collective act of re-worlding, because we are in this transition of sorts. Now note, when I use the word we, it's a kind of a proxy for the Earth's constituency. So human and non and all modes of existence that exist kind of under that rubric is what I'm referring to. And that is, perhaps I'm referring to a radical commons here. I'm not suggesting that to efface difference, but to hold difference with care. So it's a kind of a look beyond the partitions with which we place in our worlds. So what my research is kind of pointing to, and I'm going to just race through this, is that we're coming to the end of what we might call modernity and its anthropological paradigm. We could see this most clearly signalled by the Capitalocene and the systemic and environmental destruction, so clearly and causally evidenced. But also, and perhaps on a more subtle level, we're also seeing growing recognition that human rationality is not the centre of the world. We're increasingly aware of our contingency. So we could say this anthropological paradigm, in a subtle way, is anchored by the fundamental affirmation that a proposition only has legitimacy and consistency if and only if it can be linked to human experience. So I believe that we can think otherwise than that. I think that way of thinking hasn't served us in the past, and so we need to kind of open up our ecologicize our thought processes to enable other things and other life forms to produce knowledge. So I'm seeing that there's acknowledgement of other forms of knowing and political being beyond the human's acquisition or possession of cognition or comprehension. And I see that's gaining traction. We see this in multiple forms of art practice, and again, why I was thinking this is a nice follow-on from Fiona's talk. And the more, excuse the word, avant-garde, theoretical discourses that feed art practice, and so most vocal is Rosie Bradotti, who's already been mentioned, and Bruno Latour, and so on. So I think this momentum is around a kind of a radical decentering of the human, and with this an unprecedented opening of relation with the earth and with other modes of existence. So I'm saying this is not a returning to a pre-modern or a solely indigenous kind of conditioning, but more that we're moving to a non-modern paradigm, which, for what it's worth, is a pluralistic and non-othering form of decolonisation. So it's something we don't quite know what it is yet, but it's highly, in my understanding, mobile and inclusive. The human, which we often refer to under this kind of rubric of modernism, and forms of Western rationality, has been legislated to impose a certain reality, right? And that's kind of transpired by way of the Western man, primarily. However, we're also feeling that this kind of approach has been highly destabilised, and we're in fact understanding ourselves as humans as not what we've been told we are. In fact, we're something quite other, and we're not contained to this kind of rationality, but rather radically open forms of life. So I'm trying to align an idea of the human here with something quite indeterminate, a form of life that's actually quite open and then free from some of these so-called conventions about what we are. And at this current time, this points to a possibility of breaking away from being subjected to what Mark Fisher might call a capitalist realism, or complying to the entrepreneurial subject or subjectification under these sort of capitalist rationalities. So rather, I'd like to imagine that we're radically open subjects of nature. So not compliant to these binaries of individual versus collective, inside or out, nature and culture, etc., circumscribed by modernity. So subjects of nature, but not the nature that the moderns have composed it. So I'll come back to what I mean with all of this in a moment, regards to the possibility of imagining the commons and of holding a space as a political community. But first, I want to just look at what I'll call spatial protocols impacting the common or shared realms brought on by the spatial governance or tactics of control with regard to COVID. I've got a really minor PowerPoint here, so I'll just, I will share that with you. No, that's not the right share. Excuse me a minute. Where are we? got so many things. Been multitasking this afternoon. Many things on my agenda today. Here we are. Sorry about that. So we can all see that okay? Yeah. Right. So these spatial protocols so what I've been looking at is what I've called the emergence of, spatial protocols, or the emergence of patterns of behaviour in space, or spatial formats. That is the repeatable or formulaic spatial patterns readily identifiable to us all as kind of everyday actors. So very obvious kinds of things, such as the queuing and so forth, but also a realisation that what a limited range of variables what there was over lockdown in terms of spatial enactment. So it was, what was most surprising to me is how quickly that spatial consensus, as Lefebvre would call it, was endorsed. And obviously I'm talking only about the New Zealand condition here. So in Lefebvre's account, spatial consensus operates via codes of access, which define proper spatial conduct and acceptable kinds of use. So what was interesting about the spatial consensus under normal circumstances, it's very complex and culturally bound. But we were instructed in this realm of social distancing and so on, and so it authorised a kind of immediacy of valorising certain relationships between people in particular places, and sort of sets of conventions where how we're allowed to behave. So it set up a cognizance of what Lefebvre would call a proxemics, which is the sort of maintenance of conventions of boundary kind of creation. What I also found kind of interesting was this sort of increased in civil attentiveness, but at the same time, an inattentiveness. And what I mean by that is kind of a hyper-awareness of others in space, and the anonymity of others, particularly, intensified by mask wearing, and a frequent blanking, that took place with that relation. But at the same time, and on the other hand, I also noticed this increased attentiveness, whereby through body and facial expression, there was, kind of connection, non-verbal connection. So that was kind of interesting, those two aspects. So I'm speaking here to these spatial formats under COVID, and in this very short talk, I'm not talking about any digital space. I'm sort of talking about physical urban space. So the first one being this kind of hypervisibility, and by that I mean where difference is intensified. So whether that be difference by someone not doing the right thing, which wouldn't happen very often in my view, or the kind of minority difference, through kind of hyper awareness and increased surveillance, etc. Secondly, there's this kind of idea of unitisation, where we're all put into these little units, either singularly or multiple, where the dynamic between inside and outside becomes more palpable. I think in this kind of spatial formatting, there's kind of a flattening or a homogenisation of space. Somewhat of an equalising of space, which was a kind of interesting thing to observe. Also the kind of linearisation occurring through, obviously the endless queues, and the way our bodies were kind of controlled through a serialisation, through a kind of moving through a coding of our bodies and prescribing us in this kind of serial movement. And within that, the kind of irreversibility. I don't know about any of you, but sometimes I had to go back in the supermarket and I realised I was breaking the rules. It was a one-way, where these spatial alliances began to occur where you passed people on opposite kind of trajectories. So the processing of our bodies in space, I was just really kind of blown away with how immediate it was that we kind of conformed to this way of inhabiting. So what does this matrix of space open up for reimagining commenting? Well, it's very too early for me to conclude on anything in terms of explicit relevance. But what I did notice is that these spatial formats did seem to have aesthetic qualities that may point to political capacity. I'm just going to end my little show there because that was all I had on the image front. So yeah, some sort of political capacity. So if I put aside the very, the clarity of power with which it was taking place, the way with which authorities spatially orchestrated and regulated ourselves, our movements. If I put that just over there for a minute, the situation enabled a dwelling in and thus a prompting an imagination of a common realm characterised by, I think, three kind of critical or key things for me. Quietness, spaciousness, and slowness. So nothing really remarkable there, but if I just sort of talk through that a little bit. So quietness or silence was not only due to the lack of traffic noise, but the limiting of certain, fast behaviours like recreational behaviours in the street, the limiting of people having to be places in a great hurry. So there was this kind of, or quietness kind of emerging simply by a lesser friction in the world. So forms of introverted existence emerged. So a beingness rather than a doingness. And I couldn't help but be reminded of Herenga Asan's 2017 book called The Shy Radical, the anti-systemic politics of the militant introvert. And this book imagines a utopian state. It's a state he calls the Republic of Aspergistan, where the shy and the quiet, the introverted, can find solace. So I saw these qualities of quietness as opening up or valorizing, opening up against the valorization of the purposeful extrovert who makes their way in the world, that we're all supposed to be like, the ones on Instagram and, all that sort of stuff. So I saw this kind of space open for the character that's often marginalized in our busy go-go world. And so against the kind of insatiable utility of the improvement and betterment of self and otherwise. So this quality of quietness is so often effaced from the common world. So secondly, sort of spaciousness. I mean, there's been so many, image making around the vacuousness or the emptiness of the streets and so on. But I see that with sort of in a much more positive sense. I found it spacious and full of promise and possibility. So a physical freedom as well to walk in the middle of the road in the middle of the night if you wanted, and on the other hand, a kind of temporal freedom opened up by all the cancellations and the lack of recreation activity, not appointments, and so freedom from participating in the excessive demands of the economy outside the bare essentials. This spaciousness opened a deeper form of unspoken communication. So to speak with the non-human, whether the ladybirds or the invasive weeds, or the eels, it just opened a capacity to commune in a way that we always have, but it deeply intensified that unspoken communicative capacity of us as living beings in the world. And thirdly, a kind of slowness. So, we're normally indoctrinated under the 24/7 regiment installed by neoliberal demands and the rhythms of commerce, but those things kind of lost their bearings on the everyday. And in my observation, there was more of an adaptation to the bird song or the diurnal, or the adaptation to the tide or the winds. So this capacity for actually slowing down, making space for helping your yeast rise, making bread, all these kinds of slowness. I mean, this is nothing new in terms of urban movement to move to slow, but it was quite palpable how quickly there felt at least where I was doing my lockdown, a kind of a rhythm that enabled a collective imagination to kind of emerge. So on the one hand, I've observed this kind of through these three kind of dimensions, a kind of a radical inclusiveness or an egalitarianism emanating from the shared conditions of lockdown and COVID, and that in a way is an augmentation of our subjects' its nature entanglement, and our contingency to and with the common that is the earth and its movements. And I think such a thinking, bears on sovereignty to some extent, but that's a much bigger conversation than we've got time for now. But on the other hand, there was also, observing the new partitions and the new injustices that were being made. you know, such as the division between the essential and the inessential. But yeah, I mean, some of you, Jade, have already referred to that today, but again, I've got to put that aside in terms of time. And what I'm wanting to kind of advocate for here is something that I would call a stranger intimacy. And it made me think how we might organise the complexities of stranger intimacy in a kind of structural imaginary of commoning. So that is what I'm referring to here is like a pre-individual commons. Something like, for those of you know, the poet thinker Fred Moten might refer to with his refusal to consent to be a single being. So it's kind of, you know, it's a pretty radical idea I'm throwing out there, but I believe it's useful. And so perhaps the political challenge is to discover how from within this collective or this multitude, and on the basis of this sort of pre-individual commons that also, you know, Paul Verno would refer to, that there's a social force that creates the type of commons that are not yet invented or not yet seen. We don't know what it is, what this thing can do yet. Perhaps, as I've referred above, this kind of shifting of the anthropological paradigm is already tentatively underway, and the ecologization of our democratic processes taking place that we can see with, you know, ultra-global movements and movements against capital globalism and so forth are beginning to kind of re-world through these different kind of interactions. So if I was to turn to my kind of very introductory and very preliminary notes on the general ecology or the techno-ecologic condition, and turn to the it's a terrible word to say, isn't it? But the process of becoming ecological of the commons. So to bring about this form of stranger intimacy, we need to surpass the human non-human divide. We need to embrace the notion of non-human nature, that's the idea of nature without, the idea of ecology without nature, as the moderns have prescribed it. So we need to kind of consider humans and our various agencies are simply part of or within this form of nature. So it requires us to turn away from an individualism towards a radical relationality, you know, without relentlessly obeying and implementing an instrumental logic of ends-means relations. So I think to think about the techno-ecological is to think about sense. So to bring sense back into the knowledge production. So if we think about general ecology, it stands in for the critical analysis and affirmation of an environmental term, and thereby it marks kind of the key content of a neo-critical project impacting on the spatiality of the commons that brings back the incessantly dismissed concept of sense. So this insistence of sense, you know, albeit in a new guise, sense no longer the sense of meaning or signification in the signifier, but an a-signifying sense of sense, one that resolutely opposes the nihilism of the techno-logical capitalism that we kind of dwell in. So, I mean, I was, with this kind of body of work that I'm working on, I'm kind of working towards this sort of gentle urbanism idea, and I've run out of time to sort of speculate on that now. But yeah, so I'll just leave it there, and yeah, look forward to a discussion around the many dimensions that this lovely forum has brought up, Sophie. Thank you.
Ooh. Thanks. Right. So I think you've really brought us. I'm kind of here. I'm letting what I've noticed what you've done before. I'm letting a lot of what you're saying kind of go here, but actually I'm listening for the underground response, which I think you're suggesting there is something already emerging, particularly in public space. I think you're talking about. I mean, I'm trying to digest what you just said, and put it in relation to the images Jade showed us with the gardens. Ihamato gardens, I think they were, where there is the intimacy there is not so much about a public space. It's about a shared understanding and connection between people and land. But you're talking about something, I think, at a kind of perceived as a city level, right?
At a being level, really, yeah.
Does anyone want to kick off? Becky, I'm going to look to you.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I guess one of the things that that I was thinking about when you were talking is and this is meant to be provocative, is it a middle class view to be thinking about those notions of spaciousness and, you know, because I just think back to my experience of lockdown and I am an introvert, so I loved being at home and not having to interact with people face to face, and I know lots of people hated it, but I had the luxury of doing that without children, without having to worry about food, without having to, you know, there's lots of luxuries that I kind of could just dwell in. And I just wonder whether those concepts ring true if you're not middle class. Yeah,
I absolutely hear you, and you know, there's a real tension with presenting, you know, the kind of good life regards to that. However, I kind of believe people have their own suffering depending upon class, and this, believe you me, this is not to belittle people who are having to live in a house with 12 others and, you know, work at a you know, minimum wage job. I hope that's not excluded by this comment. But I think, you know, people have suffering on many, many different levels, and it's not for me to impose that kind of idea based on a class, some idea of class. So yeah, I mean, it's a good conversation and really great thing to bring up. And yeah, you're right that there's a certain privilege by me as a wealthy woman academic, you know, having time to even think about the technical ecological condition. But if we always think from that perspective, yeah, I don't know, we've got to be where we are, you know, we've got to be situated, and this is where we are.
I think that's something too, if I can jump in, pointing to Rosie's notion of affirmative ethics. It's about moving away from the identitarian and rather than working against each other, working together. And yes, it is a middle upper class privileged position often to be in that point of observation. But on the ground, it feels like there's so many dialectics that potentially hamper this kind of more open vision of what we are and who we are, the more ecological perspective.
Well, that's in a way what I'm trying to assert is that radical relationality occurs in the relation. So you are how you engage in the relation when things occur. Yeah, anyway, without an example, I can't really sort of speak to that, but it is an ethical disposition as opposed to the prescribed identitarian kind of approach.